Welcome to this LRQA webinar, How to Connect the CSRD and CSDDD from a Practical View. My name is Teresa Gigoff, and I would like to give you some instructions before we begin. Please note that everyone is set to mute during the webinar. Please use the chat box for questions. We aim to respond to the questions during the webinar, but please be with us today because we have a great external speaker that we might not be able to answer all your questions in the hour we have, but we will do so afterwards in written. The slides will be provided to you after the webinar, and the webinar will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you via email. And a final note, LRQA does not give legal advice. The following explanations are based on our interpretation of the legislation. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started, and welcome again to this LRQA webinar, How to Connect the CSRD and the CSDDD from a Practical View. The EU's transition from soft to hard law in human rights and environmental due diligence, in short, HREDD, is driving significant change for businesses across Europe and beyond. Companies must reassess and adapt their approach to HREDD to meet new regulatory demands and stakeholder expectations. Currently in the EU, the implementation of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, in short CSRD, keeps companies busy, while the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, in short CSDDD, is on the horizons. Both of these two directions are interlinked. It is key to connect them from a practical view, using synergies while avoiding pitfalls. And that's exactly what our webinar is today built around. The question of our webinar, how to connect the CSRD and CSDDD, could not be more timely in the light of the recently proposed approach of Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, to merge CSRD, CSDDD, as well as EU taxonomy into one so-called omnibus regulation. And we just heard yesterday that we can expect an omnibus simplification package by the end of February 2025, with a very likely focus on the CSRD, aiming to reduce reporting requirements. So I am pleased to welcome the speakers of today for a short round of introduction, starting with Janina Lucas from Bayer, followed by Laura Kurze, my new colleague from Ergon Associates, now an LRQA company, and Jasmine Widmer, my LRQA colleague. Over to you, Janina.
Hello all, and thank you very, very much for the invitation to this timely panel. It's Janina Lucas. I'm working at Bayer AG for almost 9.5 years. I'm our head of ethics and social impact, and by that I am responsible for, on the one hand side, the general human rights agenda at the Bayer Group, but also responsible for implementing the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act and also now the CSDDD Teresa was referring to. Happy to be here today with you.
And likewise, very happy to be joining this panel today. My name is Laura Kurze. I'm an associate director at Ergon, a new member to the LRQA family following a very recent merger. So quite excited to be here today, but also to be further strengthening our advisory offering around human rights. Maybe just a few words about Ergon, because not everybody may know us. We've been in this space, so business and human rights, labor and gender, for nearly 20 years, and have really worked with a range of leading companies across various geographies, industries and sectors on stepping up their game on human rights due diligence, and happy to share some insights from our practice today.
Hi everybody, very excited to be on this panel today. My name is Jasmine Widmer. I'm a consultant in our LRQA sustainability consulting practice based out of the UK. Over to you, Teresa.
Thank you all. And my name is Teresa Gigoff, and I'm an associate director at LRQA's European Sustainability Consulting Team. My background is in developing and implementing human rights risk management systems, as well as the connection to the increasing reporting obligations like the CSRD. For those of you that are not yet familiar with LRQA, we bring together decades of expertise in assessment, advisory, inspection, and cybersecurity services. We are operating in more than 150 countries with a team of more than 5,000 people. The speakers of our team here today belong to the advisory business unit with a focus on sustainability consulting. We exist already for more than 25 years in Europe, with offices across the continent as well as beyond in Americas and Asia. We support companies and other organizations on their sustainability journey, from responsible sourcing and human rights due diligence over net zero and sustainability strategies, as well as reporting. So what are we going to cover today? We will start by introducing you to the main intention and requirements of the two directives. And as we will see later, this is fundamental to identify synergies and potential pitfalls. Janina from Bayer will then share in a short presentation her experience at Bayer in this context, and together we will share our top 5 considerations with you when connecting the two directives. At the end of the webinar, we will have a little bit of time to answer some of your questions. Please use the chat box. And I would say, let's get started, and over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you. Let's get started with a very brief overview of what CSRD and CSDDD are. Teresa has already untangled the alphabet soup that these both present, but let's look at their intention, aim, and mechanism. Both directives, so CSRD and CSDDD, aim to foster sustainable corporate behavior, but the way they do this, the aim and mechanisms employed, are different. So CSRD, as the name already implies, is a reporting directive. It requires public disclosure of sustainability performance. It requires companies to identify and report on material sustainability impacts, risks, and opportunities. And they have to do this along their entire value chain. By this, CSRD aims to increase visibility on sustainability performance for regulators and investors, and to ultimately increase the importance of sustainability information to the same level as financial information. A quick note on CSRD. When we talk about CSRD in this webinar, we always consider the whole package, including the ESRS, so the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So we're always talking about that package together. So under CSRD, you need to report. Under CSDDD, you're asked to act. CSDDD mandates action from companies to identify and address adverse impacts. So they're asked to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence. They're asked to do this along their chain of activities, which is a term we'll unpack a bit later in this webinar. One key point to note on CSDDD is that you need to report on your due diligence activities conducted under CSDDD in your CSRD reporting, so there's an inherent connection already there. We'll talk more about key overlaps in a minute, but I just want to dive into a couple of points that led us to have this webinar today and is why we see both of those directives together. If we could go, oh, there it comes. So one of the key points that we often hear from clients when we talk about CSRD and CSDDD is the challenge of timing. CSRD is broadly already in force, whereas CSDDD is only coming into effect from 2027. This means that the human rights and environmental due diligence process that's required under CSDDD is often not yet fully implemented at companies. However, under CSRD, companies that are requested to report on their impacts, risks, and opportunities already need to disclose their management approach of those topics, which includes their due diligence process. There's a challenge there. The next challenge we often see is that reporting and human rights environmental due diligence responsibilities are not in the same departments. So those who are requested to implement CSRD and report are not the same people that are carrying out the action under CSDDD. That can sometimes lead to silos and fragmented implementation. Both of those topics then lead to sometimes inconsistent communication. So because there's different people working on different approaches and different methodologies, it can be tricky to craft a coherent narrative between reporting and action, and to bring those two together in a report that makes sense. All of those together also can sometimes bring across a lot of inefficiencies, so increasing implementation costs and difficulties communicating internally. We at LRQA, however, also see this as a big opportunity. What we always recommend is to already take view of the CSDDD requirements now, even though it may still be a little bit away, and implement them alongside the CSRD requirements. This can help you streamline implementation, it saves resources, reduces costs, and it can also minimize risk. Before we dive into a bit more into how to do that and where the opportunity exactly lies in our view, we want to quickly hear from you, and we've prepared a quick poll for that. So we want to hear from you whether you'll be focusing over the next 12 months on CSRD, CSDDD, both directives together, or perhaps another directive altogether. So perhaps it might be the EU battery regulation or another legislation. I'll just give you a couple more seconds to click in the poll. Very interesting. I'm going to end the poll here. What we can see is that many of you are implementing CSRD and CSDDD together, but some of you are mostly focused on CSRD. So to give you along a couple of points of how you can consider CSDDD already, I'll hand over to my colleague Teresa for some key overlaps between the two directives.
Thank you, Jasmine. So the next slide. No, the one before. Yeah, here we go. So let's take a look at the overlaps that we see between the two directives. So we see them in the areas of impact assessment and prioritization, prevention, mitigation, and remediation of impacts, stakeholder engagement, as well as the climate plan. So let's start with the two first ones. Both directives require companies to identify and assess adverse human rights and environmental impacts, applying criteria for likelihood and severity. And this is our key overlap. We also dive deeper in this webinar. When it comes to due diligence, meaning prevent, mitigate, and remediate adverse impacts, one of the key differences lie. CSRD requires businesses to report on the HREDD approach, whereas the CSDDD requires businesses to actually do it. Also with stakeholder engagement, the CSRD encourages engagement with the stakeholders, but the CSDDD requires it along the full due diligence process. We will also hear more about it from Laura and Janina today in this context. Both directives require the climate plan to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and the 1.5-degree goal, but this is not the focus of this webinar. And as just mentioned, the key overlap we really see in the adverse impact assessment that is required under both directives. So on the one hand, the adverse impact assessment forms part of the double materiality assessment, in short DMA, under the CSRD. And in the DMA, a company has to identify and assess material impacts, positive and adverse ones, on people and planet, as well as risks and opportunities for a business. Under the CSDDD, a company has to identify and assess adverse human rights and environmental impacts as part of their HREDD process. So both directives require businesses to identify and assess adverse human rights and environmental impacts, but the required next steps differ. The CSRD is about reporting material adverse impacts for people and planet, whereas the CSDDD requires the business to act along their human rights and environmental due diligence approach, but then report about it via the CSRD. And this is an important connection we should be aware of. We also wanted to flag a pitfall we currently see in this context around the language of risk and adverse impact. So we often observe differences in languages between people working on the CSRD and those working to date on HREDD that can cause confusion and misunderstanding. The CSRD uses the term risks to refer to external risks to the company and not to the people. Teams conducting HREDD to date tend to use the word risk for risk to the people, whereas the CSRD and the CSDDD use adverse impact in this context. So we need to be very mindful when using those terms. And I think this brings us already to further practical insights from Janina, and I would like to hand over to a short presentation.
Many thanks, and I'm now really happy to share some insights and experiences from Bayer AG when it comes to CSRD and CSDDD. I hope we can remain with these abbreviations. I think they are already enough for today. And before I'm diving in, I want to be really clear in the beginning that I believe there is nothing like a one-size-fits-all setup for implementing CSRD and CSDDD across all companies. I sincerely believe that it needs to fit to the company structure, but also how the company is working and its external environment. And because companies need to find their way how to implement CSRD and CSDDD, I highly recommend from right in the beginning to directly make themselves really familiarize and comfortable with the underlying principles of both directives, which are in the end the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, a document that had been in place way before CSRD or CSDDD had been introduced. And I can understand that there is maybe some frustration also because of the different timings that had been illustrated already, that CSRD is now already in place and CSDDD is only at the horizon. But I really can recommend to look on the underlying principles that are available since more than a decade, to really understand what is the intention behind this reporting directive and also behind this due diligence directive. And then as a second step, only look at the regulations to really be empowered to understand the spirit of the laws and to also to understand how the intention is to implement those directives. And to have this really as a treasure box, a muscle to be built up front before we are diving already very deep into the granularities about these two complex regulations. So let me start by showing our complex environment and Bayer is in order to give you some taste how we are operating CSRD and CSDDD. The company I'm working in is pretty complex. We have different business units, or we are calling it divisions, that range from, for example, pharmaceuticals, where we have prescriptive medicine, but also where we are active in the agriculture industry when we are talking about production portfolios such as seeds, but also crop protection products. We are present in more than 80 countries. We have close to 100,000 employees. And looking on our supply chain, only in our direct supply chain, you can see an equal complexity. We are even here present in close to 150 countries, so we are sourcing directly from close to 150 countries and have already in our direct business relationships close to 86,000 suppliers with multiple employees working there. And you can imagine an even bigger tail end when it comes to our indirect supply chain, but also when we are looking up the chain downstream to our customers and end users. So taking all this into consideration, CSRD and CSDDD are designed in order to reflect our business reality, to reflect on how we are operating at Bayer, in order not to create silos, but in order to create synergies over the different teams and functions. The different teams, as said, are spread across the entire group, across many countries. Besides the divisions we are having, such as I said, crop science and pharmaceuticals with a prescriptive medicine, but also another division, consumer health, where we are selling over-the-counter products. We have on top of this also something we are calling enabling functions. So these are in the end the enabling supporting functions for the business in order to ensure that they have the products they are needed, that they have good support when it comes to human resource activities, but also when we are looking on IT support, risk management support, legal support. All these supporting functions you can imagine at Bayer under the enabling function. And I am part of one of the enabling functions. The enabling function I am in is called Public Affairs, Sustainability and Safety. And both directives, CSRD and CSDDD, are managed out of this function, as we are at the interface already at all of our divisions, but also in the interface to other functions such as human resources, risk management, or procurement. I am part of the human rights team, as said in the beginning, and I'm responsible for the CSDDD, but also on the German Supply Chain Act and other regulations that are coming from the human rights world. This is the team I'm in. I have a brother team next to me. This is the environmental team, with whom we started already building up a close relationship when we are talking about different regulations where you also have environmental and human rights aspects in. One of the most present one is the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, where you already can find some environmental aspects, where we join forces and we are located not only logistically next to each other, but we are also part of the same function. And another team that is also part of the same function is the external engagement team. And here you will find colleagues that are mastering all our reporting requirements. Reporting requirements from sustainability reporting under a voluntary framework looking on indicators such as GRI, but who are also supporting more financial reporting efforts already in the past when we are looking on the non-financial reporting directive, like the successor of the CSRD. And already since many years, it is designed like that we content team owners from human rights or environment, that we are working the entire day. And once a year, we provide the feedback to the reporting team, who is then compiling a report out of the actions that are initiated. And how we are looking on this, so we are having the doing first and then the report in the end, and feeding and feedback from the reporting learnings again back into the doing cycle. So it's an ongoing cycle we have established since many years at Bayer. And one of the cycles I brought today is actually the cycle of human rights due diligence, which is in the end also not a rocket science exercise. In the end, what also Teresa was explaining, it's a risk management approach or an adverse impact approach to identify the biggest risk on people. And this is grounded in the UN guiding principles in business and human rights. We started the design of this already some decades ago, but also here we are learning while we are doing. We are learning from other peers, from other inspirations, but we are of course adapting our framework if needed in case new legal requirements are asking us to adapt to that. But the framework is in place and we are reporting already since many years about the outcome out of it. One thing important to mention, what we at Bayer did right in the beginning, we identified both risks already, the risk to people and the risk to business. So this double materiality Teresa was referring to. And this is something I can highly recommend as well. So while the UN guiding principles are focusing more on the risk to people to really identify the most vulnerable groups, we already considered the risk to business, as we are also a big company, we have shareholders, we have more external input, and besides the UNGPs when we are designing our framework. And this is what I was referring to in the beginning. You need to understand first, what are the stakeholders, what is your external environment, what are the underlying principles, and then find a way on how you can bring both human rights and environmental due diligence alive. And then using the legislations in order to make your framework more stable, to inform it more, to make it stronger, and to align the language with the authorities who are in the end enforcing those laws. So also part of this due diligence cycle is the reporting in the end, and we're reporting on different means about our efforts since many, many years. In fact, Bayer has long time standing experiences reporting and communicating externally about our efforts when it comes to environmental and social and safety topics. In fact, our first report can be dated back to 1976, where Bayer was reporting already about environmental and society aspects, more under the non-financial sustainability world. There had been a time between 2013 and 2018 where we at Bayer have been a front runner to develop an integrated reporting. So an integrated reporting to have multiple sustainability aspects in the management report and the financial reporting. So in the end, what CSRD is now aiming for, to have it really part of also the financial community world. We stopped it for some reasons. The main reasons had been really that the requirements, also investors, civil society organizations, our own employees, multiple stakeholders had been put forward to us, made this integrated report bigger and bigger and bigger. And we needed to have really the space to share our story, our sustainability story. So we had to spin off in 2019. And now we are looking on the CSRD report, which we are working on, even though the German government, so this is the legislation we from Bayer would need look to, have not yet come up with the final text, but we are ready, we are working on it, and would be ready to publish it next year. I want to leave you with this first interventions before we're coming to more questions, was something to be considered in case you're just starting with reporting. What I can promise you that the first report you are producing has nothing in common with the same report you will produce in 2-3 years from now on. I brought an example, and you can also see it externally on our website, for our human rights reporting on fighting modern slavery. You will find our modern slavery act statements online. The first report where I've been, for example, actively involved in comprised 4 pages, and the law doesn't change. The law is there since 2015. We've been preparing a report, 4 pages. We've been pretty proud of it. We thought it is a fully designed report, and we published it as required. Now, some years later, our report comprises 18 pages. And it looks not only much nicer because we have some graphics in, but also because we are learning over the course of time. We are learning how others are reporting. We receive good feedback from the authorities. We also learn on how to improve our processes at Bayer. So the better our due diligence is, the more we are doing, the more we have, of course, to say. And I'm pretty sure that the first year's ID reports won't look like the same in 5 years from now, which is good, I believe, because it is in the end about continuous learning and improvement. And I like to leave with the call for actions I had already in the intervention introduction. I really recommend to look under the underlying principles first before you are trying to nitty-gritty looking on the regulatory requirements, and then really using the laws to strengthen your efforts.
Thank you, Janina, for these insights and showing that it's possible to implement legislation like the CSRD and CSDDD based on a robust methodology that is grounded in the UNGPs, and by making the early connection to the existing risk management. I find that super interesting. But we also know that every company is at a different stage, and you also touched on this, and everybody has their own implementation journey. And we have therefore brought together our top 5 considerations based on our experience of the last months and years. And yeah, depending on what processes are already in place and what expectations or regulatory expectations need to be met, the priorities can vary. So, for example, some companies have no human rights and environmental due diligence process in place, but need to conduct a double materiality assessment under the CSRD now. And others have already a due diligence in place and need to connect it now with the CSRD requirements. And with this, I hand over again to my colleague Jasmine, who shares the first consideration with us. Over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you, Teresa. The first top consideration that we wanted to talk about is the value chain definition. So that's that chain of activities I spoke about earlier, and the value chain under CSRD. Under CSDDD, you're required to conduct due diligence along your chain of activities. Your chain of activities, as you can see in this diagram, includes your upstream supply chain, your own operations, and a limited amount of your downstream, wherever it touches on transport, storage, and distribution. CSRD, however, the reporting directive, requires you to report on your entire value chain. What we recommend here is to enable you to report consistently in your reporting, include the downstream perspective in your CSDDD due diligence and your general human rights and environmental due diligence from the beginning. This enables you again to craft a coherent directive, coherent reporting, and to carry out coherent action as well. To come back to the underlying principles that Janina was also speaking about, that is also reflected in both directives. Our key recommendation here is to focus where your potential and actual adverse impacts are greatest. So not to spend time on understanding which of your downstream activities fall under CSDDD and which ones do not, but to spend that time instead on focusing in on where in your value chain might you have the greatest impact and focusing your efforts there, both for action and for reporting. Now I'll hand over to Teresa for the next consideration.
Thank you, Jasmine. Just need to move the slide. Yeah. So yeah, as we've learned before, one of the key overlaps and connections is the adverse impact assessment under both directives. But where to connect it? So usually, and as Janina also pointed it out, the doing comes first and then the reporting. So the existing human rights and environmental due diligence process, and in the future aligned with the CSDDD, feeds into the double materiality assessment under the CSRD. So we currently see two opportunities where this can happen when looking at the DMA process. You see this here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the typical DMA process. The first step of the DMA is the development of a long list of topics. So it covers all potentially relevant sustainability-related impacts, risks, and opportunities along the value chain. For companies starting with a DMA under the CSRD, this list of topics can be extended by potential adverse impacts based on the HREDD process, like the rights to be considered under the CSDDD. You see them in its annex. You would then assess them together with other sustainability topics of your long list. And this is how we currently approach it with clients in this situation. And this brings us to the second step of the DMA, the impact materiality assessment. So it identifies what impacts does the company have on people and planet, applying criteria for severity and likelihood. So if a company has already a human rights and environmental due diligence process in place and is already assessing its adverse impacts using severity and likelihood, the results could be included here. But in this step, it is helpful to seek alignment in terms of the methodology used. Jasmine will tell us a bit more about it in a second, but before that, I actually would like to turn to Janina again with a question. Because as Bayer having already a human rights and environmental due diligence process in place, how was your experience in that context when making the connection? Can you share a bit with us in that context?
Yes, of course, happy to do so. So at Bayer, as said, we've been building our framework based on the UN Guiding Principles, and they are grounded in severity and also a likelihood. And we also blended it with the potential risk to business, as because of the reason I mentioned, we have also other shareholder interests for the entire group. So the methodology from the UNGPs as a first step, what we do, we've been teaming up with our enterprise risk management colleagues at Bayer, as they have many experiences already to run enterprise-wide risk management efforts, but mainly focusing on the risk to business. So what we've been doing here is the first step before this legislation and also the German law kicked in. We've been teaming up with enterprise risk management and adapting the methodology there in order to ensure we have the risk to business and risk to people perspective covered. And this assessment we are conducting every year to confirm or add or adapt our results. But as they are the top priority risks, it's very unlikely that they will change very soon. In case they would, likely they wouldn't be on the top. So what did we do with CSRD? We plugged in our results identified as the impact assessment needed from the double materiality aspects on CSRD.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's super helpful, your practical view. And I think Jasmine has prepared another poll for us because we wanted to understand how experienced our audience is with impact assessment. You're on mute, Jasmine.
That's right. I just realized. Thank you. Yes, we were wondering whether you've already assessed the adverse impacts of your company on people and planet, whether that's something that is already very established in your company, or whether you're currently doing it for the first time or recently have done it for the first time. I can see people are still voting on this one, so I'll give you another couple of seconds. Seems like we have a very varied picture amongst our attendees here. Many of you are saying that you already have an established approach. Some of you recently did it for the first time, and about 20% of you are planning to do it for the first time in the next 12 months. Some of you have not yet started, so I have some key considerations for you in the next slides on how to align methodologies and key considerations for how to do it. We could go to the next slide, please. So there's 3 key considerations that we would like to pass along for the alignment of the assessment methodology, both under CSRD and CSDDD. The first one is what you're assessing. So we recommend to review the topics you're assessing under CSRD and CSDDD and to give them a common definition. That way, when you're speaking to different departments across the organization, you're always clear on what everybody's talking about. The next consideration is the alignment of scales and the how you're assessing. So when you assess different factors for especially severity and likelihood, which are relevant for both assessments, as we've heard, ensure you're using the same scales. So if you have a scale from 1 to 4 to assess something from low to high, ensure you're using that in your double materiality, but also in your impact assessment under CSDDD. If you use 1 to 5, low to very high, make sure you translate that. That then enables you to, at least for severity and likelihood, reuse or translate the same factors more easily. The third key consideration here is to use the same data sources, so to align for both assessments on what you consider relevant reports and what's relevant internal data. Especially if you use an external tool or a platform for these assessments, make sure you're using the same or similar tools for both assessments. We often see this pitfall happen when you don't have as much information about a specific stage of your value chain and you need to make a qualified assumption. Especially if you need to make assumptions, make sure you're using the same assumption or at least the same data basis for both assessments to enable you to translate results more easily. So in short, across what you're talking about, how you're measuring it, and on what basis, ensure alignment where you can so that the results can transfer more easily. If you do have slightly different methodologies, which Teresa will speak a bit more about in a minute, just be very clear on what the differences are and what the implications are for both assessments, so for your double materiality and for the adverse impact assessment. What we recommend is to integrate them into the same process wherever it's possible, similar to what Janina was explaining, to avoid any parallel work streams. To talk a bit more about different results and what that might mean, I'll hand back to Teresa.
Thank you, Jasmine. Yes, that's the slide we need. Yes, so I'd like to share what we currently see in the context of potential different results. So as explained before, the CSRD is already in place and requires to report about material impact, risks, and opportunities, as well as the human rights and environmental due diligence process itself. But the existing human rights and environmental due diligence process are often not yet mature enough, are not aligned, and this can be the reason for potential differences. So depending on topics considered, methodology applied, data used, it happens, for example, that less topics are material under the DMA than under the human rights and environmental due diligence process, future CSDDD. And the next step, especially under the CSDDD, will then be to align the adverse impact assessment process and methodology, because a business should report on the material adverse impacts that are also the identified impacts that due diligence obligations apply to. But in any case, you have to be clear on the consequences that can be of regulatory and strategic nature. So in terms of regulatory consequences, theoretically, the due diligence obligations under the CSDDD apply for the results of the adverse impact assessment under your HREDD process and not for the material topics under the DMA. But in practice, this is of course connected because you should report about your due diligence activities. And then I also like to share with you something that we observed in terms of strategic consequences. So what we quite often see is that after the double materiality assessment under the CSRD, the sustainability strategy of a company is reworked. And the results of the DMA form very often the basis for this process to enable a company to report progress in the following years on the material topics as well. But different results may leave out, for example, important existing due diligence processes that resulted as not material in the DMA. The consequences can be no inclusion in the sustainability strategy and the related missing budget allocation. And I think this again highlights the importance of alignment and is a clear call for action to start implementing the CSDDD as soon as possible. And at this point, I also have a question for Janina, because I think it would be interesting to understand if you had any challenges with difference of results, but it seems a bit your process was already so well connected from the beginning that you didn't have that issue, but it would be great if you could touch on that.
Yeah. And let me start by actually underlining what you said regarding also the business case on implementing the CSDDD as soon as possible. This is also something I would definitely underscore and underline, or implementing the UN guiding principles, because then in the end you have the same language here. The results in the end are the same, but also on our journey it was a lot of discussion on is the methodology really the same? Because from the human rights point of view, or the human rights world, you often talk about more art than science, and it's more qualitative. And then we are now confronted with the CSRD world, with many data points to collect it, to really have the fear of being forced to confirm on a particular granularity of a risk or an impact. So for us, we've been happy with the result that we plugged in the same result, but the journey to create internally an understanding with the new people, especially the people from finance, that is also something that caused internal discussions to find the same language and to find confidence and trust that methodologies and the spirit behind both actions are in line. So I would say it was more challenging on the journey to get to it, but in the end, the results can be compared.
Okay, thank you. So there's hope. Thank you, Janina. And now I hand over to Laura for stakeholder engagement.
Great, thanks very much, Teresa. And we have stakeholder engagement as our fifth key consideration, and that is because stakeholder engagement obviously is a really, really key concept, both in sustainability due diligence and in the impact dimension of double materiality. And consequently, it's a really key principle both in the CSRD and its associated reporting standards, as well as the CSDDD. So if we have a quick look at the CSRD first, there's basically two types of stakeholders that are relevant. And the first really important one are people, individuals or groups who could be affected by a company's own activities or in its value chain. So it's their perspectives that will really help us in understanding how exactly they are affected, and then thereby also understanding what our company's material sustainability topics are. So stakeholder perspectives are a really key element that should feed into your double materiality assessment. The second type, just for the sake of completeness, under CSRD are obviously the stakeholders, or those who will be consuming or receiving a company's sustainability disclosures, so the people to whom a company really accounts for how it identifies and manages sustainability impacts. And now when we talk about a company's or a company identifying and managing their impacts, we are in core CSDDD and thus due diligence territory. And there also the CSDDD puts a really, really strong emphasis on meaningful and effective stakeholder engagement as a key and cross-cutting element of sustainability due diligence. So really informing key steps such as your risk assessment, development of prevention and mitigation action, monitoring of effectiveness, and again, really emphasizing the role and relevance of those who may be affected by a company's activities. And under CSDDD, this engagement with, as I said, with affected stakeholders should be really informing your due diligence process as a whole. There's 2 points that I would quickly like to highlight on CSDDD. First, it may not always be possible to safely and meaningfully engage with stakeholders, and especially rights holders. And that can be for a variety of reasons, would probably go beyond the scope of this webinar. But the CSDDD recognizes these limitations and says that in such instances, companies should instead be engaging with experts that can bring relevant perspectives and insights on the risks in question to the table. And the second point, just very quickly, touches on the concept of meaningful and effective. Again, we could probably spend more than 1 hour just discussing how to make stakeholder engagement meaningful, but there's some pointers in the CSDDD which we have included on this slide as well, and they relate, for example, to providing relevant information, to making sure that you are aware of and address engagement barriers, which can be language, location, lack of trust, but also in protecting against retaliation, meaning that no stakeholder should be at risk as a result of having engaged with a company. So there's a quite noteworthy emphasis on the quality of the engagement in addition to its existence. Now, very quickly, what does this mean in practice? What do we make of this? Where to start? And Janina, you called on us to not get lost in the nitty-gritty, but to really do what makes sense in light of the underlying principles, which really resonates with our experience here also. And therefore, I just wanted to share some very brief practical considerations. And after that, I have a question for you, actually, but I'll quickly speak to those points first. So as with really many things, a really good starting point is to have a look at what you already have. So this should include mapping out who your relevant stakeholders are, but also checking where you may already have touch points with those stakeholders. And that may be in different parts of the business, right? So if you're a B2C business, there's surely a part of your business that's already engaging with consumers or consumer organizations that you may not have had on your radar so far from a sort of sustainability, human rights point of view. Likewise, in many industries, there will be multi-stakeholder initiatives, industry initiatives where you can sort of streamline approaches. So map out who your stakeholders are, where you already have touch points, and then where the gaps may be, and take it from there. Another very quick point, shift in perspective. So we're moving from the traditional understanding of stakeholders to a focus on rights holders, to people who may or actually are affected by something that our company does. And so we're also moving our focus from managing those stakeholders to really engaging with them. You're there to listen. You're not there to talk necessarily. Yeah, so that's a really important point there. And finally, streamline your engagement, really crucial point. We've heard it's relevant in both directives. So it's really important to plan this properly to make sure that you get what you need out of it, whilst avoiding overburdening both your own teams as well as your stakeholders. So don't make this a tick box exercise. Don't send sort of very long and generic surveys to people who may not actually be able to comment on the questions that you're asking them, because the information that you're getting back may not really be what you need in order to drive both your materiality assessment, but also your due diligence. So I'll probably pause at that point and turn to you, Janina, because obviously, you've been doing due diligence for a really long time, and I'm sure that involved quite extensive stakeholder engagement as well. So what would be quite interesting to hear is, how do you see this changing in the context of the implementation of CSDDD, and where?
And I think one important point you mentioned already to understand first, where are the potential stakeholders or rights holders a company is engaging already with, and also to be clear that it will be, I can confirm, very impossible to engage with all those who want to be heard or who want to have an engagement. Looking on Bayer, only our own employees, we have, as said, close to 100,000 employees. They could be qualified as potential rights holders. We have the employees of our direct suppliers. We are not even able to quantify the numbers here. We are located in so many countries. If you consider also the neighbors, the local communities, they are just a lot. And I can understand that this could provide a feeling of being paralyzed or overwhelmed, where to start, and is this, can this cake even be eaten, or should I postpone or focus on other topics? But I can really encourage not to do that, because first, Nobody says you need to do all at once at the same time. It is important to understand your business setup, where you could potentially impact rights at most, and then find rather dedicated, hyper-localized engagement activities that can be with the local works council or with the local trade union, or it can be with a partner with whom you anyhow are working on sustainability topics. It can be with a relevant supplier you want to have as part of your portfolio, but maybe the supplier is not yet there where it should be, to really understand where can you provide the biggest impact negatively, in order then to understand who are the rights holders to bring to the discussion early on, and listening to them to, in the worst case, have a better risk assessment in the end and learn and make better engagement activities. Step away from providing more and more PowerPoints or webinars if nobody is using it, but talking to the relevant people on the ground, and they're really focusing not all at once, but starting with potential risky countries or potential risky key products or potential risky supply chains, and rather do it focused and meaningful instead of all at once.
I think that's a brilliant summary, Janina, and very much goes to the pitfall that we noted at the bottom there, right? So it's really about leveraging the incredible opportunity, both in terms of as a source for information, but also innovation and potentially cooperation that meaningful stakeholder engagement can offer, while avoiding the pitfalls that may be associated with sort of poorly managing it. So thanks very much for that insight. And back over to you, Teresa.
Thank you so much to both of you for this super interesting insights. And yeah, I think it was our last consideration. I just wanted to share the top 5 in a nutshell. So be clear on your value chain definition. Know where to connect your human rights and environmental due diligence process in future CSDDD aligned with the DMA under the CSRD. Seek methodology alignment of the adverse impact assessment. Understand differences in results and the consequences, and engage with your stakeholders in a meaningful way while using internal synergies. And I think there are some minutes left for some questions from the audience. And for this, I hand back to Jasmine.
Yes, we've received a number of really interesting questions. Thanks, everybody. I would like to point the first question to you, Janina. And somebody's asked, for the assessment of adverse impacts, from a time perspective, how much time would you say should be allocated to the exercise? You spoke a bit about that it took a while to get there. So from a time perspective, could you give us an indication?
If you are doing it the first time, I think calculating an entire year is fair. Why? Because depending on how big your company is, but for a company of our size with so many products and people working at Bayer, so many different divisions functioned, it takes time to internally understand better through the human rights lens. What do we have in place? Finding credible external stakeholders, starting a meaningful engagement so that they could inform our activities, bringing it back then to the colleagues. I think a year is a fair assumption if you're doing it really the first time of our size. The smaller, maybe the quicker you can move forward. And we're doing it now every year, and now we can speed up quite significantly.
Thank you for those insights. The next question also goes again to more of like internal organization, and I'd like to pose that one to you, Laura. Who from the company should be involved in this stakeholder engagement exercise?
I will have to give you a classic consultant's response here, which is it depends. It really depends on the stakeholder, and I think it also depends on what the engagement format or channel or whatever you want to call it is, right? As I said earlier, and Janina, you've also given some examples, there will be a number of existing ways in which a company engages with stakeholders, which will be owned by different departments or functions within the company. That doesn't mean that you have to overhaul that ownership, right? I would actually say it presents an opportunity to sort of share ownership across the business and bring the whole business on board with what you have to do under these directives. So something that we tend to do and that works quite well with clients is, as you map out who are your stakeholders, how are we already engaging with them, map right next to it a kind of a RACI chart. So who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed. Not in all instances does it have to be the sustainability function or whoever's leading on CSRD, CSDDD implementation that also needs to lead on the stakeholder engagement. It can be owned by another function, but the other relevant, the sustainability team or whoever is working on the implementation of the directives can either be involved in the engagement or can be informed afterwards or prior to the engagement.
Thank you. I think we have time for one final question. And I've seen a number of questions come up to that respect. So I'd like to pose that one again to you, Laura. We spoke a little bit in the beginning about the omnibus regulation. And the question that's come in from different perspectives is kind of, should we wait until the omnibus is out? How do we structure our implementation at this point in time?
So I personally say that waiting is a risky strategy for everything that we've outlined over the course of this webinar, including Teresa's point around starting early, starting now, but also Janina basically giving a really good example of how having started a while ago puts you in a really strong position to now actually take action and prepare for these directives. So I would say waiting to see what happens is a bit risky, and you may also lose momentum that you've already built up internally within the business if you now sort of put it on hold. So my recommendation would be continue to prepare, continue to make sure that your due diligence is up to scratch.
Thank you for that. We have a number of other questions. Thanks everybody so much for those. Those that we didn't get to, we'll answer to you in writing via email after this webinar. And just to close us out, I'll hand back to Teresa.
Thank you so much. So a big thank you to our panelists, especially Janina from Bayer, for taking the time and sharing her great insights and experience with us. But of course, also to my brilliant colleagues, Laura and Jasmine, for their great contribution, as well as further colleagues behind the scene. Kerstin, thank you. And to wrap this up, I think also in the light of the potential omnibus regulation of the European Commission, it is more important than ever to keep in mind the intention of the regulations we discussed today, to foster sustainable corporate behavior. And as emphasized by Janina today, the basis for this is to build a robust human rights and environmental due diligence framework by understanding where the adverse impact of your business on people and planet lie that you should first focus on. This will also then enable you to understand where you should report on. So on behalf of LRQA, we thank you for your participation and we wish you a successful end of the year. Feel free to reach out in case you have any questions, and it would be our pleasure to support you. Thank you and goodbye.